How many of you have ever crossed a border in your life? Raise your hand. Just keep your hands up. Let's say a geographic border, an international boundary. How about a racial border? How about a gender border? It's good to see some border crossers in this sanctuary today, because the Jesus of the Gospels was a trespasser and a transgressor of cultural, religious, gender, and social borders. So church, the place who profess to follow Jesus, should be a place where I can find some border crossers. So I invite you to think of one of those crossings. When you raised your hand, one of those that was significant for you. Just think of one. If it wasn't for you, maybe it's from one of your ancestors. Was this crossing a one-way crossing, or was it two ways? Did you have a choice? Was it a forced migration or crossing? What was the primary motivation? Were you free to move, or was it clandestine? And when you crossed, how were you received? Were you welcomed, or were you turned away? We remember our own crossings because remembering is an important part of our faith. The whole Eucharist reminds us the importance of what it means to remember, to put the members back together, to reconnect, to come back from the past to the present, to come back together as a community. The importance of remembering our migration or border crossing experiences in our lives is to do what it calls us to do in Exodus when it says to remember that you were once foreigners. In the reading of our scripture today, we also remember a story that many of you probably have heard before, the story of Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well. This week, we celebrate International Women's Day. And it seems fitting that it's even remarkable to think about how the stories of women made it into the Bible. There's so many centuries of ingrained patriarchy and cultural bias that seems to exist in almost all cultures. I recently came across the Women's Lectionary and learned that there are actually 111 named women in our Bible. 111. How many can you name? And this doesn't count the many more women and girls who are unnamed, like the Samaritan woman. So many women in the Bible are very little preached about. The Women's Lectionaries, written by the biblical scholar and professor Wilda Gaffney, seeks to tell the good news through the stories of women in the Bible who are either completely overlooked or, when they are named, portrayed as bad news. She exhorts us to read and preach about women every day, not just International Women's Day. So today we look at the Samaritan woman who has been given no name, but just her racial and ethnic marker. The reading is about crossing borders. And in this story, it is Jesus who is the traveler. Jesus is the outsider who comes into Samaria. He's on his way from Judea to Galilee, and the only way to get there is to go through Samaria, the mountainous region that is today part of the occupied West Bank in Palestine. It's Jesus who is the one who is tired. It's Jesus who is the one who is in need. It's high noon, it's hot, and he is thirsty. He finds a well and a woman there, To even speak to her is to cross gender social rules of male and female strangers talking in public, to cross racial and ethnic divisions between Judeans and Samaritans who are geographic neighbors but have a relationship fraught with conflict and prejudice and animosity. The woman is at the well fetching water as she does every day, but it's noon. She's alone. She's not there when the other women are there, perhaps indicating that she herself is marginalized for some reason. And so there are many reasons why the disciples are shocked when they later find Jesus talking to her. But it is Jesus and the Samaritan woman who biblical scholar Fred Craddock notes have the longest conversation and dialogue between Jesus and any other person written in the New Testament. Jesus comes to the well and says, "Will you give me a drink of water?" In the crossing of borders, we see God. Who are you in this story? Maybe you are the sojourner or the migrant, the outsider in some way, who's in need of a drink of water and a place to rest and the help of a stranger. Or perhaps in this story, you're the Samaritan woman, tired, worn out from life, weary, dealing with what's already on your plate, and maybe a little suspicious. You are asking me for what? Maybe you're feeling boxed in by gender or race or circumstance. We find out later in the story that the woman has had 5 husbands. But we know little about the deeper story. There are many things that can keep us from reaching across borders. Political reasons, cultural reasons, social, and emotional. But Jesus comes to the well and says, "Will you give me a drink?" And in the crossing of borders, we see God. Jesus is represented by the 1 in 7 persons in the world who is an international or internal migrant. Jesus is the woman who faced the hard reality of forced migration. And like the Samaritan woman, there is a deeper story. The woman who's forced to migrate by the lack of work, by gender discrimination, by government policies which don't ensure a safety net or decent wages. A woman who's forced to migrate by the contamination of lands, by international mining and land evictions, drought or extreme storms. The woman who cannot feed her child, pay their school fees, buy their shoes, and whose only option is to seek work elsewhere. The big city or the next rich country who'll pay 10 times in 1 hour what she would earn in a day at home. The women who are forced to migrate because of violence from intimate partners or a society which targets trans, lesbian, gay, and women's bodies, or the violence of hitmen who are hired to intimidate women to keep quiet, not to protest, or to move on. The violence that's rooted in governments which fail to protect women and prevent gender-motivated killings. The violence of war, the proliferation of weapons and guns, and impunity. Women whose only option is to migrate for lack of justice and a place to live freely. Jesus is the women who have to leave in the middle of the night, bringing 1 child with them and leaving another child behind, who travel on the journey and in the desert, in the bottoms of cars, the bottoms of big rigs, being chased by helicopters and drones, being separated on the journey, lost, or detained. The women who face the brunt of deadly immigration policies that come out of governments every day, that think that making immigration illegal will somehow make it go away, but only makes it more dangerous. More than 7 out of 10 female migrants who travel through Mexico to the US border are raped along the way. The decisions of Congress to appropriate money to deter migrants has made sexual violence part of the price of freedom. Making migration illegal not only makes it dangerous, but also lucrative for organized crime. The Mexican and Guatemalan US militaries, profitable for defense contractors, for prison guards and private prison shareholders, which profit off of women and migrant bodies through detention and deportation. Jesus is the face of women who have been barred from seeking protection and safety and reuniting with family because of the Muslim ban, the slash in refugee numbers, Title 42, which has effectively barred asylum seekers during the COVID-19 pandemic and deported planefuls of Haitian families on site without even an interview with a judge to a country beset by political violence and instability. And the recent announcement just this week that President Biden is proposing detaining migrant families once again in the United States and proposing another form of a ban on asylum seekers who are seeking international protection. Women are coming to the well and saying, "Will you give us a drink of water?" But they have no bucket. They have no means. They have no legal pathway. A 30-foot well or a 30-foot wall separates them from survival. The scripture story doesn't end in the ask for water. Jesus says to the Samaritan woman at the well, "If you knew who I am, you would have asked me to give you living water. If you knew who I am, you cannot imagine what I bring and could offer to you. The gift of God that heals all wounds, the gift of God that quenches all thirst. Could it be that migrant women and men and families carry the gift of God to be offered to us? Have we not seen and been open to what they seek to share, to the gift of God which they carry? In the crossing of borders, we see God. The Samaritan woman nearly shouts with glee. She says yes to living water. She says, "This is the thing I couldn't even name, the greatest thing I thought didn't even exist, the thing I've been yearning for." And Jesus gives her one requirement, it seems, and tells her to go get her husband. A husband, like seemingly a man to credential her, to give her status or power or personhood. A husband, something she had in the past, in fact 5, but currently legally none. We don't know if her husbands had died or if they divorced her or if she had to marry her husband's brothers under the law or what the circumstances were. But she tells Jesus without shame or anything. She tells Jesus that she has no husband. And Jesus doesn't require her to have one, but only to tell the truth, to name what is true. Lent is a time for us in the Christian tradition for self-reflection, a moment where we can look in ourselves and name what is true, what is, to be honest with ourselves, to own and accept what we are, to know that no matter our condition, our past, our present, living water is lovingly and generously offered to us. Jesus comes to the well and says, "Will you give me a drink of water?" And in the crossing of borders, Jesus began to realize the universal scope of his mission, and that love and liberation would not be bound by social, ethnic, or religious convention. It would be one of inclusion and shattering the borders of separation. The woman of the well found that her yearning, her honesty, her courage to cross borders would set her free. Women and other migrants are moving their bodies and children across borders, yearning for life and for security and freedom. They are defying policies of deterrence, ignoring presidents who say don't come, and nonviolently resisting and coming anyway. They say, "It is for my children, for their future, so they can live, so I can live. No price is too great." Will we have the courage to see the truth? Will we be bold enough to reach across the borders and say yes? Jesus comes to the well and says, "Will you give me something to drink?" And in the crossing of borders, we see God.